Okay, so I think we are just about ready to begin. First of all, I wanted to thank everyone for signing on to today's webcast. My name is Sullivan-Dubrowsky, and today I'm going to be talking about how I'm using the Anybody software in adjusting the axle placement in wheelchair users to minimize shoulder joint forces. Okay, so like I said, my name is Sullivan-Dubrowsky, that's me on the left, and I am a PhD candidate in biomedical engineering from Rutgers University in New Jersey, and I do my research in collaboration with the Kessler Medical Rehabilitation Research and Education Center. It's in association with a rehab hospital in northern Jersey that specializes in stroke and spinal cord injury rehabilitation. Before I really dive into the presentation and what I'm going to be talking about today, I want to take care of a couple of administrative things. If at any point during the presentation you have any questions, please feel free to ask. To do so, just take a look at the slide here. You're going to need to type in your question into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and I'll answer it if it's relevant to what I'm talking about now, or one of the panelists will answer it. And any other general questions we'll get to at the end. And I definitely want to encourage you to ask questions when they come up, even if you're not sure if they're relevant, because even if they're not answered immediately, they'll be on cue to be answered at the end. And it's better to ask now while you remember than save it to the end and potentially forget. But you guys are the lucky ones. This is the second time we're doing this, so hopefully we've worked out the kinks and can answer any questions that you guys have. Okay, so let's get started. My overall goal is to create a patient-specific model of wheelchair propulsion. There are tens of thousands of new spinal cord injuries each year, and of the newly injured that use manual wheelchairs, many of them will develop shoulder pain over time. There is some thought that the repetitive motion of propulsion may contribute to joint breakdown and subsequent pain. So my thought is that to minimize these joint forces may prolong healthy shoulder life, and I see the model as potential for use in prescribing wheelchairs to new wheelchair users, especially in ideal placement for these individuals as they are prescribed their wheelchairs. I also see it as potential for use as an intervention tool. So here's a brief overview of what I plan on covering today. I want to briefly talk about what data I need for the model and how I go about collecting it. I want to spend some time talking about the construction of the model and the two means of validation of the model, including comparing EMG activity between the computational and the experimental results, as well as a kinetics comparison between the experimental and kinetics experimental results as well. And lastly, I want to talk about how I'm going to use the model to determine an ideal seating placement for, in this case, one individual. I have a larger database of multiple individuals. However, just for today's presentation, I'm going to be talking primarily about one individual. So briefly, let me talk about the data that I've collected for construction of the model. The original skeleton that I've pulled from the Anybody repository has upper body measurements based on the Dutch shoulder model. However, I've scaled the model to reflect my subject, meaning the height and the weight of the subject in my model is reflective of my participant, and such anthropometrics such as the upper arm lengths and lower arm lengths are the same in the model as they are experimentally. And I have also collected a number of wheelchair measurements, such as the seat placement relative to the axle, meaning the height of the seat relative to the axle, as well as the anterior-posterior position relative to the axle. I have the backrest angle, the seat dump angle, as well as some chair dimensions, meaning the backrest height, the seat, the chair depth, width, and length. And all of these I'm coupling with the subject anthropometrics to build my model in the Anybody system, in the Anybody software. I'm collecting 3D kinematics from each subject, and I'm doing that from the Vicon motion analysis system. So I have reflective markers on upper body bony landmarks, and I have the 3D trajectory of these markers throughout space, and I'm using that to drive the motion of the model. And I also have some kinetic data from force sensing push rooms. I have the Fx, Fy, and Fz propulsion forces from some smart wheels, which, like I said, are force sensing push rooms that wirelessly collect data and dump the data that it takes for each subject to propel their chair. So the forces that they're propelling their chair with, I'm able to collect wirelessly. And lastly, I'm going to be collecting some surface EMG from 12 muscles. I'll talk more about what particular muscles later, but I want to mention that this is critical for use in validating the model. Unlike the first two things I talked about, the anthropometrics and the measurements, I'm not using this EMG to help build the model, and I'm also not using this EMG to help drive the model, like the kinematics and the kinetics, but I'm using it to aid in validating the model. Oh, and for those of you wondering what the blue lines are coming from the wheelchair backrest, those represent frictional forces or contact forces between the subject and their wheelchair. And I think also now is a good time to talk about the scenario in which I'm asking these participants to propel. They are on a dynamometer, and I'm asking them to propel at a self-selected speed from which I'm collecting 20 seconds of data, multiple trials, and I am looking at 10 consecutive push strokes. All of the data that I'm going to be showing today, I'm only looking at the contact time of the push stroke, so I'm not looking at any recovery. I'm only looking at the hand-on to hand-off part of the propulsion. Okay, so real quickly, before we dive into this any further, I want to make sure everyone's on board here. If you aren't, hopefully you are at least reading this and changing what you need to catch up with us, adjusting anything you may need to get some sound here. And if you are on board, if you could just bear with me a second while we catch everyone up. I'm going to give everyone about 20 seconds to catch up here, and then we'll move on. All right, so back to the model. As you can see here, I have a still picture of my participant on the left-hand side of the screen and my resulting Anybody model on the right-hand side of the screen. Note that the wheelchair seat positions are exact between the two. The backrest angle as well as the chair dump are accurately or are identically represented in both scenarios. And also notice that the handoff positions are exact as well. Also, the shoulder position relative to the axle is the same between the two situations. So physically, I've created a model that appears similar to my experimental participant, and from here I'm going to drive this model, as I mentioned before, with subject kinematics and kinetics. And via the inverse dynamics in Anybody, I'm going to get joint and muscle forces. So here's where we start looking into how accurate is this model. We look and we see visually, I know that it has the same wheelchair inputs and subject anthropometrics. I know I'm driving it by subject data measuring. But how do I know whether or not the results I'm getting looking at EMG or joint forces, how do I know if those are accurate? How can I validate this model? So quickly I want to tell you that for those that may not know, the muscles in the model are represented as multiple fibers. So for example, the anterior deltoid is represented by 6 muscle fibers. So my first step was to find which part of the muscle my surface electrode was collecting data from. Obviously, different parts of the muscle may have different activities throughout propulsion. So I then compare each computational fiber's activity with the experimental activity. The highlighted purple fibers correspond to participant EMG. So for example, in window 1, the two highlighted anterior deltoid fibers correspond with the collected and analyzed subject EMG for this muscle. Window 2 looks at the biceps, 3, the pectoralis major, 4, the posterior deltoid, window 5, the trapezius, and window 6, the triceps. Okay, so now that I know which fibers correspond to my collected data, I start to look into comparing the activity envelopes between the computational and the experimental results. So first I want to talk about the top graph or the top picture is obviously from the slide before, and that's showing the muscle that I'm looking at and the resulting graphs below. I want to talk a little bit about the axes and what we're looking at here. So first thing I want to mention is that the x-axis on all of these graphs is the contact time of each push stroke. So for example, at the 0 point of the x-axis, that's the time that the hand is making contact with the wheel. And the end of the axis, where it cuts off to the right, is the time that the hand is being released from the wheel. So knowing that, also we're going to look at the y-axis, which is the muscle activity. Now above the x-axis and the positive y values, this is the computational results that anybody is calculating. And you can see the shape of the curve for this particular muscle, the right trapezius, for each of the push strokes. So it's unfiltered. This is exactly how it's been output. You can see that anybody is predicting based on the building of the model that the right trapezius in push stroke 1 will fire at approximately 3/4 of the way through the contact time of the push stroke. Below the axis, I'm just representing linearly with a solid line experimentally when the muscle begins to fire and when the muscle ends firing. So this doesn't show the shape of the muscle activity or where the peak muscle activity may occur. It just shows the on and off time of each burst. So for each subject, I'm going to look at 10 consecutive push strokes and compare the activities. So these first 4 push strokes, you can visually see a similarity between the computational results, the blue, and the experimental results, the red. On push strokes 1, 2, and 3, you see some muscle activity spikes as calculated by anybody. I ignore those to be physiologically unrealizable results. There have been some previous literature which has investigated the muscle activity patterns in individuals using a manual wheelchair. And for a muscle to be considered on in these papers, they have to be active for greater than 5% of the push stroke. So I'm using this as a guideline from this previously published literature. So for example, when I'm calculating and quantifying the comparison between the computational and the experimental, I'm not going to be looking at these individual spikes that you see to the left of push stroke 1, at the very beginning of push stroke 2 or the very beginning of push stroke 3. I'm neglecting those. So this is push strokes 1 through 4. And here are the remaining push strokes 5 through 10. So again, you can see the similarities in the computational and the experimental results. You may also notice the fact that, in general, looking at this, the right trapezius fires in the second half of the push stroke for all 10 push strokes. Not only in the second half, but I would say most like in the last quarter of the contact time of the push stroke. So I did the same kind of graph for each muscle, the same kind of sets of graphs. So for example, the left and the right anterior deltoids, I had 10 separate graphs for each of those, from which I took the muscle activities at 10% increments, so I normalized each push stroke to be the same length, and then I averaged them. So this is a comparison. Once again, let me go over the axes. The dotted or the dashed lines, I should say, are the computational muscle activity results averaged over 10 push strokes. And the solid line underneath the x-axis is the experimental activities averaged over 10 strokes, at least the burst duration when the muscle fires on and when the muscle fires off. So the top is computational, the bottom is experimental. So going through these, you can see that both the left and the right anterior deltoid experimentally show activity throughout the entire contact phase of propulsion. And computationally, you see that reflected quite well. There's activity throughout the entire phase, or the entire contact phase. Moving down and looking at the biceps, the left bicep, experimentally you see activity up to maybe 60% of the contact phase of propulsion, and you see that computationally a similar value of muscle activity. It appears that at 60% the muscle activity fades to zero and there is no more activity at that point. So that's another good obvious similarity. The right bicep is, they both computationally and experimentally have activity early on in the push stroke. However, it appears that computationally the muscle is on slightly longer than what we've calculated experimentally. So you can see how I'm looking at these and finding similarities or disconnects between what I'm calculating with anybody and what I'm actually measuring off my participants. So the left pectoralis major and the right pectoralis major, you can see again it appears as if the muscle is firing, we've calculated experimentally, from the very beginning to about 2/3 to 75% of the way through the contact phase. And you see similarly, anybody has calculated similar values for this as well. So now looking at the rest of the other 6 muscles that we have, posterior deltoid is interesting here. Experimentally, we see that it is on both in the beginning and the end of the contact phase. Computationally, the right posterior deltoid matches up with this quite well. You can see that there's zero activity in the middle part of the push stroke for the right posterior deltoid. However, for the left posterior deltoid, there's some activity right around 50%. So I think it's important to note here that I'm looking at the average of 10 push strokes. So while in this scenario there might be activity in the beginning and the end for all push strokes, and maybe only a couple push strokes show activity at this 50%, it's going to be reflected in these graphs. I'm not excluding any data. I'm looking at 10 consecutive push strokes. So that may explain why some stuff does not match up exactly. So moving on, we have the left and the right trapezius. Remember, the right trapezius was what we looked at previously from the red and the blue graphs, and remember that it was on experimentally and computationally at the end of the propulsive stroke. So you can see that from the right trapezius graph. The left trapezius graph is, there's a little bit of a disconnect here. According to the computational results, we would think that the muscle would be on for maybe the first 2/3 of the contact phase, and then off maybe at the last 5 to 10, on again maybe at the last 5 to 10%. That's not what we're finding experimentally. We see 2 bursts, the first quarter of the propulsive stroke and the last third of the propulsive stroke. So there's a little bit of it doesn't match up perfectly well there, but again, I'm going to get into how we've quantified this and the numbers that we're getting when we quantify these. And then last is the triceps. This I should put a big star by, because if you look experimentally, the triceps are active from the left triceps for 50% of the push stroke and the right triceps for nearly the entire push stroke, but computationally they are hardly active at all. On the left side you can see that they're active maybe at 80% of the push stroke on, And on the right side, there is some slight activity, but really not a lot of similarities between what we're finding experimentally. So I'm going to talk about this in a second. So here is how I quantified what we were just looking at visually. So there was a previous report that looked at the mean absolute error in a similar scenario, comparing jaw muscles that have been measured by surface and fine wire EMG to what the Anybody software is predicting. And this is previously accepted literature. And the MAE for multiple tasks in this scenario, meaning there was some chewing, some cyclic chewing, some cyclic protrusion, and also some clenching force with some clenching tasks. The mean MAE was 0.078 to 0.139. If you neglect the triceps, our range is 0.068 to 0.224. And this compares well to the previously reported literature. One of the reasons that we might have a little bit of a higher number on the higher end of the range there is that all of our muscles were collected via surface electrodes, and that 6 of the 10 in the article that I'm referencing was collected via fine wire. So that may be one of the reasons that there's a little bit of that we have numbers that are slightly off when it comes to comparing to the results that were previously found. So I just want to take a look at this. I've highlighted this triceps left and triceps right. This is obviously a very large mean absolute error. Something to look into if the triceps are not being calculated to be active computationally, what is picking up the slack. The good news here is that this has nothing to do with any of the software or any of the modeling aspect of it with regards to the geometry of the bone or origin or insertion or anything, because I've done similar studies on different subjects and gotten a very good similarity between the triceps computationally and experimentally. So it's just this particular subject, and further investigation is ongoing into why the triceps really don't match up at all. So 10 of the 12 muscles match up fairly well, so we're happy with that. The triceps, like I said, leave a little to be desired, but we're working on it. Okay, so I had mentioned that we were going to talk about computing, so we're going to talk about building the model, then we were going to talk about validating the model, and I mentioned that there were 2 ways that we were going to validate. One of them, we just talked about comparing the muscle activity outputs between computational and experimental, and this is going to talk about another means of model validation, kinetics comparison. So here, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to alter my inputs into the model, and I'm going to compare a separate set of outputs. So I'm not looking at muscle data anymore. I'm comparing something else. So previously, I drove the model with kinematics and 3D kinetics applied to the hand. So remember the smart wheel forces that I had collected? I was applying those to the hand and driving the model with kinematics, the motion of the body. And then because you need the motion and the force to use inverse dynamics to find the muscle activities, I was then comparing the muscle activities to what I had collected. So now what we're going to be doing, remember, we're not going to be looking at muscles. We're going to be doing something else. I'm going to take the kinetics that I got from the smart wheel, and I'm going to isolate the f of x. And from the f of x, I am going to derive the wheel torque. So using the force in the x direction, I'm going to multiply by the radius of the wheel, and I'm going to get the torque from the smart wheel data. So I'm neglecting the Fy and Fz forces at the hand with the original smart wheel data, and I am going to be just looking at the f of x in the way that I'm looking at the torque data. So now, instead of driving the model with the smart wheel inputs onto the hand, I'm going to take that f of x, or that new calculated torque data, and I'm going to drive the wheel. And I'm going to use the same motion that I was using before, the same kinematics movement that I was using before. So now, what I'm doing is I'm driving the wheel, and I'm using the motion of the Vicon, and then I'm going to be seeing what are my contact forces at the hand. Now, it makes sense, I'm going to talk about this in a second, it makes sense that the contact forces at the hand, especially in the f of x, will match up exactly, because that's what I'm using to derive the torque. So the contact forces at the hand, as a result of the torque of the wheel and the motion of the body, should be exact, because the torque is dependent on the f of x. So I'm comparing the resulting contact forces with the original smart wheel forces, and the traces are exactly measuring up. What I'm also comparing is the smart wheel, the original f of y, with the new calculated contact force at the hand, the f of y, and when that shows similarity and the traces are the same, that's impressive, because the f of y that I just calculated in the model is completely independent of any of my inputs. Remember, I'm only using the f of x as an input into the wheel torque. So the fact that I am able to get out an f of y that matches my smart wheel is a real positive means of validation. Now I'm just going to take a minute and let this sink in, because we had a little problem with this earlier today. So I want to just kind of let this sink in, and then I'm going to review it one more time, because this is kind of a tricky concept here. So take a second and think about this. So in review, I am taking one component of the smart wheel data, the f of x, and I am I'm calculating a torque. I'm driving the model by the torque and by the kinematics, and then I am looking at the resulting contact forces at the hand, the contact forces at the hand between the wheel and the hand. The resulting contact forces in the x direction should match up exactly with the smart wheel f of x, because the smart wheel f of x is derived to derive the torque. The f of y that we're getting, the contact force, the validation here lies in the fact that this f of y directly matches with the smart wheel f of y, and that is completely independent of any of the inputs that I've put into the model. So therein lies the validation. So I'm sure we'll have questions on this a little later, but I just wanted to try to reiterate this, because I know it's a little bit confusing. Okay, so now I'm pretty confident in my model, at least when looking at the two validation means I've been looking at, the EMG and the Kinetics comparisons. So how about looking into the resulting shoulder joint forces? How do shoulder joint forces calculated here compare to those measured in vivo or calculated previously? Well, before I get into the quantified numbers of the shoulder joint force, let's look into how the shoulder joint force is defined and take a look at this visually. So what I've done here is I've made the muscles and the bones to be slightly transparent, so that while you can still see the outline of these of the muscles and the bones, we are now able to look into the shoulder joint socket. And by into this, I mean this is a sagittal view of a participant, their right-hand side of their body. So the green arrows are the boundaries of the glenoid cavity, and the black circles outline this defined area. The blue arrow is the resultant force in the glenoid cavity, and that is the result of the purple arrows, which are the force distribution in the glenoid cavity. So what I'm showing you here are the shoulder joint forces at approximately 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, and 90% of the contact phase of propulsion. And intuitively, it appears to make sense as 15% of the way through the contact time as the individual is pulling up the wheelchair, and then 30 to 45% as they are starting to reach top dead center on the wheel, and then 60 to 75% as they are then pushing over the arch of the wheel, and then 90% as they are preparing to go into recovery phase. You follow the resultant joint force, and it makes sense with regard, it's intuitive. So qualitatively, this is what's happening. Now, let's talk a little bit about quantitatively. So in quantifying these magnitudes, we get a graph like the one on the left. There's a couple graphs here. I'm going to focus on the left one for a minute. And again, this is the result of averaging 10 push strokes. So I'm looking at 0, 10, 20, 30% of the push stroke. I've normalized the push stroke, and I'm averaging the Fx, Fy, Fc, and the resultant force, and I get an output like this. So on the right-hand side, we have a graph of an individual who is, what happened is 7 months prior to this data being collected, this individual had an instrumented shoulder joint implanted. And this individual came back 7 months post-operatively and had forces in his shoulder collected telemetrically through a variety of different tasks. So there were some reaching tasks, there were some abduction, flexion, pouring coffee everyday tasks, hammering a nail, overhead movements, and all of this was recorded telemetrically. And there was also this movement which is being shown here, which was walking with 2 forearm crutches. So where you see the horizontal arrow that says 1, this is the partial weight bearing part of the, as this individual is walking, and the horizontal arrow that says number 2, that is the full weight bearing by the crutches. So full weight bearing scenario. And you can tell that not only by the shape of the curves and by the fact that I'm telling you that, but it's also at that point 100% of the individual's body weight, the resultant force. So there was no wheelchair propulsion movements that were collected in this study. However, I chose the graph on the right because I thought that this was most reflective of a motion similar to wheelchair propulsion, as opposed to, for example, a reaching task. So again, we're looking not necessarily for the exact force curve or force production, but more so in the magnitude. And in fact, the graph on the left is in the scapular plane, the graph on the right is in the humeral plane. So again, we're looking at the magnitudes here. So in the partial weight-bearing scenario, it appears that the resultant force is approximately 70% of the body weight. And this is a 100-kilogram man, which results in approximately 685 newtons. Now, our graph, we get approximate values of about 500 newtons for the resultant joint forces during self-selected wheelchair propulsion. And obviously, there's a bit of a difference between the two. However, I think it is important to note that there is obviously a large difference between partially supported crutch walking and a nice self-selected propulsion speed. I think that if we had our participant pushing the wheelchair much more aggressively, we'd have some higher numbers that might be more reflective of partial weight bearing. But in this scenario, it's of the same magnitude, and I think that the results here are promising. I want to also mention that there has been some previous work done that has used computational models to calculate shoulder joint forces throughout propulsion or throughout quasi-static types of motions, and they as well lie in the same magnitude as what we are finding, so that is positive as well. So that gives us some parity between some in vivo measurements and some previously calculated data. So now we have constructed the model, validated it with EMG and kinetics, and we've also seen that the shoulder joint forces appear to be of the same magnitude as in vivo as well as computational calculations. So now we can investigate how these forces may change if we alter some model inputs, namely the axial positioning. So the axial placement was increased and decreased in both height and anterior-posterior positioning by 5 centimeters in all directions. So what happens is, starting from where the axle currently is, it was moved forward, the model was run through, the max shoulder joint was calculated, then it was moved forward and up, and then the model was run through, the maximum shoulder joint was calculated, etc., through all these different points. And here's the resulting mesh plot of the parametric study. The 25 points are plotted here, and the point where the two black lines intersect is the current axial positioning. So I want to quickly note that this is only for one push stroke, but I'm making the assumption that it will be similar for all push strokes because this individual is pushing at a nice and easy self-selected speed. So I'm not anticipating that there's going to be a lot of shifting around in their chair. This is a very cyclical, well-defined, relaxed propulsion pattern. So I'm making this assumption. However, future work should investigate more than one push stroke to see that it does display a similar sort of graph as this, but I just wanted to mention that this is just looking at one push stroke. So you can tell from the two black line intersection that it appears as if this individual is nearly ideal in their axial placement. But closer inspection reveals a true minimum with a seat height 2.5 centimeters lower than the current setup. So the original seat height is marked by the black vertical line, and for this subject, the original placement is nearly ideal, but you can see slightly to the right of that there is a lower joint force. We're only looking at the right-hand side, by the way. There is a lower joint force where the seat should be moved 2.5 centimeters lower. So in quantifying this, here's what we have summarized. There is a 2.38 Newton difference between the ideal seat height and the current seat height. So this is less than 1%. We're talking 334 newtons to 332 newtons, give or take. And the question is this significant? This is something that's going to be talked about in future studies. We need to know whether or not 2.3 newtons, is it worth adjusting the wheelchair axle placement for this small magnitude? And the question becomes, what are the effects of multiple cycles over multiple days over multiple years? So thousands of cycles at 2.38 Newton difference, is it significant or is it insignificant? So it's kind of, this is early on. These are still things that we need to talk about, we need to adjust, we need to be aware of. But this is a recent result. So while it appears that this individual has an ideal axial placement, it's obvious that there are axial placements for this particular individual that result in a nearly 15% increase in joint load. So if this person were to be 5 centimeters lower and more forward, then their load on their shoulder would increase by nearly 50 newtons for every push stroke. So while this person may be nearly ideal, another person may benefit dramatically if they displayed a similar sort of pattern and their seating position was off slightly. So, and that is what needs to be investigated in the future. The next step is to find a subject whose seat placement is not ideal, and then run a parametric study to determine how their seat should be moved. After that, we would want to move their seat and then bring them in to retest them and see the model's results. See if actually the suggested axle placement, once they were re-outfitted with EMG and kinetics and kinematics and reset into the model, if that new seating placement did or did not create minimal shoulder joint forces. So we have a database of participants to analyze, and as I go through, like I said, this individual that I am looking at currently appears to have good axle placement. However, I'm sure that there are some individuals that I will be looking at who do not. And using the model, I want to find one of those subjects to run this pre- and post-axle adjustment study on. So that is where this is currently headed. So with that, I'd like to take a moment and thank the following people, places, and institutions, in particular Rutgers University and the Kessler Medical Rehabilitation and Research Education Center, in particular Matt Urasi for his help in analyzing EMG data. He really helped streamline all of the raw data that I got from subjects. So, it was normalized and the burst durations were calculated for ease in comparing with the anybody computational outputs. And I'd also like to thank Aalborg University and the Anybody Project. I had the pleasure this past summer of spending 3 weeks over there and working directly with some of the individuals who created the software. So I really feel like I got to learn some of the ins and outs of the software, and I got to work on validating my model alongside them. So it was really a great opportunity, and we had a great time. So I'd like to thank everyone involved with this as well. So I'm going to put up the question and answer help slide back up here in a second. So please feel free to ask any. Okay, the first